Tonight, I wanted to start my talk with a story that may be kind of familiar to you, but I want to try to give it an unfamiliar spin. The story starts in 1848 in England. Now, at the time, Charles Darwin is 39 years old. He's a fairly famous naturalist. He's written a book about a trip he took around the world. And at the time, he's developed an obsession with barnacles. And people don't know that much else about him. They certainly don't know about this theory he's quietly developing, which he wouldn't present for another 11 years. Now, Darwin was a naturalist, an amateur naturalist, and there were lots of amateur naturalists in England. And one of the things that they liked to study were butterflies and moths. For example, like this moth, the peppered moth, which you can pretty much see where it gets its name from. And so in 1848, there is a new report about peppered moths. People would make little notes about where they saw the moths and when they saw them and so on. And in 1848, there was a report that there was a peppered moth that looked kind of strange. It wasn't particularly peppered. It was actually quite dark. As far as I can tell, Darwin didn't notice this, nor did he notice that naturalists started to see this form more and more often in more and more places over the years. By 1895, shortly after his death, around Manchester, 98% of the moths were like this, not like that. So why was this happening? Now, in 1896, a naturalist named J.W. Tutt offered an explanation. So he noted that England had been burning an awful lot of coal. This was the Industrial Revolution, and starting in the early 1800s and increasingly through the 19th century, they're burning more and more coal, producing lots of smoke, lots of soot, and that was settling on trees, and it was killing lichen on the trees. And so he suggested that that peppered pattern was going from being an advantage to a disadvantage. Instead of being blended with the trees, these peppered moths were standing out. And likewise, a dark moth would blend in nicely with the dark color of the trees without the lichen. So this was actually an example of what Darwin had been talking about. And he was essentially saying that this case of natural selection had been happening while Darwin was alive, while he was working on the origin of species. And so it was quite a striking coincidence. But the thing was, at the time, that scientists didn't really understand genetics very well, so they really didn't understand how natural selection works kind of in a nuts and bolts level. They didn't even really know ecology that well. They hadn't really kind of come up with systematic ways to do experiments. And that really wouldn't change until the mid-1900s. An English ecologist named H.B.D. Kettlewell and his colleagues basically decided to test Tutt's hypothesis. And so what they did was they would release light moths and dark moths into the woods. And they would release them in two different areas. One was unpolluted and one was heavily polluted, near where these coal plants were, where there was a lot of dark trees. And what they would find was, when they would try to recapture the moths, is that they could find a lot more moths that matched their background. And you can see in the picture like that on a dark tree, that dark form matches pretty well, whereas the peppered one doesn't. So Kettlewell's experiment was a pretty good start. It wasn't the most sophisticated experiment. Scientists looking back on it today would say, like, well, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't do that, and I would do this, and I would do this, and I would do that. In any case, it was a good start. And in order to illustrate his point, he actually would take dead moths and he would stick them on a trunk to sort of show you what he was talking about. And that photograph is, in fact, those moths are dead. Creationists grabbed onto this and basically tried to turn all of this into a grand indictment of all of evolutionary biology. That if you're not familiar with this affair, it might sound strange, but that's really what happened. And so this is a site called Back to Genesis, and there was an article written in 2003, and Henry Morris, a noted creationist, declared, "Most creationists and most evolutionists are well aware by now of the fall of the evolutionist icon, the peppered moth, which for many years had adorned the pages of introductory biology textbooks as the prime example of evolution in action. Its removal has also been accompanied by a sad exposure of the world of scientific academia as often a world of pettiness, inordinate rivalry, and tender egos, sometimes tempting to near fraud in the tweaking of reported results." You know, I mean, I will certainly, you know, not deny, and I bet Ned wouldn't either, that there is sometimes pettiness and inordinate rivalry in science. But that doesn't actually mean that the world's 6,000 years old. And you know, the fact is that the peppered moth story is actually stronger than ever. Actually, a Cambridge biologist named Michael Majerus just got it into his head to really go back and rework the peppered moth example. Not staging moths on trees to photograph them, but actually going out and photographing them, like this one. You might not have actually noticed that there was a moth there, but that's actually a moth. Making the point that, you know, a peppered moth on a lichen-covered tree really does blend in quite nicely. So one of the other things that Majerus did was that he launched a big experiment, much bigger than what Kettlewell had done. He released over 4,800 moths, some dark and some light, and then he observed how they landed on trees. He noted, were they landing on branches, were they landing on trunks, and then he was looking at, you know, cases of how often, looking for cases where they're actually being eaten. That's not so easy to do. So he would then collect moths every day. And basically what he figured out was that every day, a dark moth on a light, licheny background is 9% more likely to die on average. And when you're talking about evolution, those kinds of percentages matter a lot. And so, because you have to remember that moths only live for a few days in this stage, so if you're 9% likely to die every day, that's going to put a crimp in your lifestyle. So the point being that that there really is a very strong evolutionary force that's driving moths to have this peppered appearance when there's a lot of lichen on the trees. Likewise, there's a strong force driving dark moths if the trees are dark. So on top of that, you know, there was a question about whether the difference between the peppered moths and the dark moths was actually genetic. Some people said, well, you know, just sort of the experience of being around dark trees might make some moths dark. You know, it's sort of Lamarckianism or something. I don't quite get what that argument was. But science marches on, and actually scientists have found, you know, the mutation on the gene that's responsible for making a peppered moth dark. So they can say to you, like, this is the gene. And actually, if you look at lots and lots of moths in England, you can actually see how that mutation arose a couple centuries ago and how it spread very quickly. You can actually see the signature of that history in the moth's own DNA. So now we have another record of this happening. And the fact is that, you know, those peppered moths are just one species that had this black alternate version. There are actually over 100 moth species in Britain alone where this had happened. And in the United States, a similar thing actually happened where here in the US, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, around places that were heavily polluted, you would start to see these black moths showing up. So, perhaps the most striking vindication of the peppered moth hypothesis, and the nicest one to think about, is actually that people passed laws and cleaned up the air, first in Britain and then in the United States. And in both cases, as soon as the air started getting cleaned up, you would start seeing graphs like this one. This is, I believe it's observations around Leeds. And you can see how after the 1960s, boom, there's this big crash until, those dark moths are actually kind of hard to find now. So that's exactly what you would have expected from this hypothesis that natural selection was happening in our own time. So, this is actually, as the creationists say, an example that is in many textbooks, and it should stay there, I think, because it really is a great way to show people how evolution happens. But I want to point out a different lesson that you can draw from this long story I just told you. Why did those moths evolve so strikingly? How did that happen? What was the cause of those moths evolving? Well, it was us. We did it. We, by building plants like this and creating all sorts of pollution, we started driving those moths in a new direction, a new evolutionary direction. And then later we drove them back. And actually, what I want to talk to you tonight about is how there are a whole suite of examples of our being able to drive evolution, and doing it simply by creating this modern civilization, this industrial civilization that does things like produce pollution. This is kind of a striking thing, and it's certainly something I don't think that Darwin himself really kind of reckoned with. If you look at Darwin's writings, he certainly acknowledged that people could create change. But he liked to look at examples like dog breeding or plant breeding. And so the domesticated plants that we eat, or the beautiful flowers that we grow, these were all examples of artificial selection, where people would select which individuals got to breed based on the traits that they liked, and generation by generation you would create a tremendous transformation, like turning a wolf into something like that. But that was, for him, it was just an analogy for what was happening over much longer periods of time in nature. So for Darwin, if you wanted to see how real evolution happened, you would have to go to look, for example, at fossils that would show you what was happening over billions of years. And I would say that kind of attitude that evolution doesn't really have anything to do with us has really lingered for a long time. The fact is now that scientists are observing a lot of cases of natural selection happening in the wild. A lot of times they're going to very exotic, faraway places, like the Galapagos, which was one of the places where Darwin went. So here's a very inaccessible island where you can find Darwin's finches. And Darwin had collected some of these from other islands there, but in any case, you can see that their beaks vary a lot, and they vary in terms of how they get their food, how much force they're delivering, what kinds of seeds they're picking up. Are they picking up little fine ones, or are they picking up big ones they have to crack, like nutcrackers? And for the past 40 years or so, Peter and Rosemary Grant of Princeton have been going out there pretty much every year, and they have been studying these birds on this one island in every way imaginable. And by doing that, they have been able to really document evolution in their own time. This is one of the premier examples ever found by scientists. And what they found was that bar there shows when a big drought happened. And so all of a sudden the plants on the island changed. There were a lot of very hard seeds left behind, and the nice soft little ones were very hard to find. So the birds that could eat those hard ones, they were the ones that survived, passed their genes on to their offspring. Boom, you can actually see the evolution of bigger beaks. Now the climate has continued to change, and their evolution has continued to track that. So in some years, actually, it's not so great to have a giant nutcracker beak. You actually want to have a smaller one where you can pick up smaller seeds faster. But in any case, by going to this pristine place and watching this sort of natural laboratory, scientists see evolution in action. So it might seem kind of strange for scientists to go to, say, New York to study evolution. Like, why would you go here to see evolution happening? But the fact is that, just as there's a big drought on the Galapagos, which is a disturbance, we showing up and building cities like New York or Boston is a disturbance. We're changing the environment. And so, for example, the white-footed mouse lives in the woods in the eastern United States, perfectly happy until people come to places like Boston and like New York and start tearing down a lot of those forests and putting up buildings in their place. These white-footed mice are not, I should point out, like house mice. They don't go into your kitchen and start eating your food. They actually just like to stay in the woods. And so they stay in the woods, like here. They stay in the arboretum. They stay in parks. They're very timid. They don't like to cross sidewalks. And so basically, now they have to survive in parks. And so as places like New York have sort of fragmented these existing forests, these mice have been surviving there. And just recently, some scientists have been going out and studying what's happened to them. I sort of tagged along with them to write a story for the New York Times a little while ago. I was with someone named Jason Munchie South from Fordham, who, beforehand he'd been, tracking, I believe it was elephants, and now, he comes to New York and he tracks mice. And what he wants to do is he wants to see how they evolve. So one of the things he did was he looked at the genes of the mice in the city, and he compared their genes to the mice out in the countryside. He said, is there something special about cities that is favoring certain genes? And so you've got the country mouse and the town mouse there. And, the town mouse is explaining to the country mouse that actually he has some very unusual DNA, actually. So this is a graph. Basically what it's telling you is that there are certain gene variants that are kind of above this line. Those are just gene variants in New York City mice. They're really unusually common there. And it turns out that these gene variants have stuff to do with the immune system, with detoxifying poisons. There seem to be some things involving the sexual biology of mice. It seems that there are certain things going on in these city mice. They're having certain experiences that are favoring certain kinds of gene variants. And it may be, for example, that they're living in these parks, which are not, the forests of old. They're actually got a lot of pollution in them. They're crowded. They may be experiencing more diseases. In any case, we're starting to see the evolution of city animals there. And what's really interesting is that, I mentioned to you that these mice, they don't move around much. So, a mouse in Central Park is not going to just, stroll down Fifth Avenue and go across the Brooklyn Bridge and see how his friends in Prospect Park are doing. He's going to stay in Central Park. And is just going to mate with other mice in Central Park. So Jason wondered, well, what happens if I compare the mice in different parks? So he went all around the city trapping mice and sampling their DNA. And these are actually different parks around New York. And this is just a way of kind of representing different sort of combinations of genes, gene variants. The takeaway point here is basically that You know, in the New York Botanical Gardens, the mice are different than the mice in Pelham Bay. They're different than the mice over in Forest Park or Jamaica Bay or Casina. They have genetic differences. In other words, they're diverging. I'm not saying that they're different species, but New York, for these mice, has basically become kind of like Galapagos Islands. They are relatively isolated from each other. And you can see this happening. And this has just happened over the past, really over the past couple hundred years. Now, when I talk about civilization, I'm not just talking about cities like New York and Boston. You know, civilization extends far beyond cities to the places that supply the cities with their goods. And that transformation does a lot of different things. One of the things it can do is it can create new species. Unfortunately, some of them can be really bad species that can make us incredibly sick, like HIV. HIV only came to light in the 1980s, and then suddenly it took off and is one of the worst diseases that we have faced in the 20th century. And there's been a long question about where it came from. Where did this thing arise? There are a lot of conspiracy theories that somehow the CIA had created it from scratch. But when scientists actually looked at the DNA, the genes, I should say, of HIV, and compared it to other viruses, a very different story emerged. Most HIV in the world comes from this branch up here, and they're all very closely related to these here. And the blue line, as I show here, these are all chimpanzee viruses. So it's clear that HIV that infects humans evolved from a chimpanzee infecting virus. And you can look at this little spot on the evolutionary tree and say, okay, well, where did this happen? And if you look at the location where scientists found the viruses in these chimpanzees, you actually get a pretty striking pinpoint of where this happened. It's not just all chimpanzees that have the closest HIV-like virus. It's just from one little spot right there. And so you can be pretty confident that this is where HIV started. So then you can ask, well, when did it happen? And you can actually look at the different patterns of gene differences in viruses and use that actually as a clock. So ever since HIV originated, there have been new mutations popping up on each of those branches. So if you count up the mutations, you can start to get an idea of when this thing happened. Oop, right there. And a big advance with all this came when scientists discovered some preserved HIV in tissue samples in a hospital in Kinshasa, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, not too far from where it's believed HIV got its start. And they actually, believe it or not, were able to sequence the genes of these viruses preserved in this paraffin for decades. An amazing achievement. And it actually, you could see how many mutations had built up by then, back in 1959, and then work your way back. And this is a kind of a hideous figure. I'll just show it to you briefly so your eyes don't start bleeding. But the point is, if you take all these things, including this sample right here, you estimate it back down to the early 1900s. That's when HIV hopped over from chimpanzees, at least the HIV-1, the most common one. So now we know when. And that really helps you to get a sense of how. So how was it that a virus that infects chimpanzees becomes a huge human epidemic in the early 1900s in Cameroon near Kinshasa? Well, it really doesn't seem to be any coincidence, because there was a lot happening at the time. What was happening was that this whole area was being heavily logged. Belgians had taken over much of this area in the late 1800s and were basically extracting as much as they could out of it. Rubber, timber, all sorts of goods. And they were using rivers for transport. And Kinshasa was exploding. So here's Kinshasa in 1896, and there's in 1955. So basically what happened is that people were hunting chimpanzees for meat, what seems to be happening. That had happened in the past, and there may have been some virus hopping over from chimpanzees to people. But now there was the opportunity for this virus to get into a large population of people and explode, and then spread, and to spread from Kinshasa all around the world. So, it's no coincidence that some of these new pathogens, like HIV, or more recently like MERS, have been basically tracking human activity. Unfortunately, we are generating new diseases. Another kind of sort of textbook example of evolutionary change is another case where we have changed the landscape. Farmers have been using chemicals. They've been using chemicals for centuries, but industrial chemicals they've been using over the past century to kill weeds and kill bugs. And those weeds and bugs have evolved resistance. What's interesting is that recently the whole approach to farming has changed radically through genetic modification. So a lot of the corn in the United States, for example, is genetically modified. And one way that corn is genetically modified is that the seeds carry a gene actually from bacteria. It's a bacteria that infects insects. When the bacteria gets in the insects, it produces an enzyme that basically rips up the insects on the inside, and eventually they die. So insects eat these plants, they get the enzyme from the plants, and it rips them up on the inside, and they die. And they do die. And so it's seen as an effective way of killing off insects that would otherwise ravage these crops. It sounds very high-tech, very advanced. It is. However, evolution has not stopped. In fact, by creating this sort of genetically modified based system where the plants are making their own pesticides, we have just basically created bugs that can resist our genetically modified plants. And this is a little graph basically showing farmers have been noticing that some of these genetically modified corn fields are getting hit hard by these pests. And the problem fields, basically, if you look at places where there isn't the genetically modified corn, there's really not much of a difference between these resistant bugs and the susceptible ones. But if you go over to cornfields where they are using GM crops, these resistant bugs are doing really well compared to the susceptible ones. So this just shows you that we have produced a new population of bugs that is basically undoing, as it were, all of this genetic modification. Another sort of surprising thing about sort of our chemical transformation of the world is that it's not just changing life in cornfields. Actually, it's actually driving evolution in other places, actually some really unexpected places. So for example, this lake in Minnesota, you might not think that this would be a place where you would look at the effects of modern agriculture having an evolutionary effect. But it seems like that's what happened. Some scientists went to that lake I showed you, South Center Lake, and they drilled down into the muck. And they pulled up eggs. These are eggs of these water fleas, Daphnia. And they had basically gotten trapped in the mud. They'd never hatched. And so these scientists started coaxing them into hatching. And some of them would hatch and would be perfectly healthy. And then they started putting dates on the soil, on the sediment, I should say, where the water fleas had come from. So how old are these fleas, these water fleas that were resurrecting? And some were 10 years old, and some were 20, and some were 50 years old, some were 100 years old, some were 700 years old. This is an amazing example of what scientists are calling resurrection ecology, where you can actually bring things back to life and then study them. You can look at their DNA, and not only that, but you can see how they live and the way they lived 700 years ago. And what's amazing is that the big difference that you see between water fleas 700 years ago in this lake and now is how they deal with phosphorus. So phosphorus is essential for life, but it's very scarce in a lake, at least in a lake where there aren't a bunch of people around. But as soon as there are people around, they're going to be putting fertilizer on their crops, and there's going to be runoff, there's going to be discharge from people's houses. Basically, you're going to get a lot more phosphorus. And what happens is that the old water fleas, they would hold on to phosphorus. They would cling to it for a long time. They would recycle it in their tissues. And the scientists were actually able to see this happen. Here's a water flea that's been asleep for 700 years. Let's see how it grows. Starting about 100 years ago, there's a shift, and the water fleas now, they don't hold on to their phosphorus. This is a genetically encoded trait. They're like, I don't need it. I'm awash in phosphorus. I don't need to waste my time dealing with phosphorus. And 100 years ago is when people in Minnesota started doing heavy-duty farming. So the water fleas are telling us that wild animals are evolving in response to this chemical change. Now, we don't just use chemicals to kill plants and animals. Sometimes we use fishing boats. Hunting, obviously, again, is not anything terribly new. You can find fish hooks dating back like 70,000 years. But modern civilization has developed really impressive ways to kill a lot of animals. And that has actually taken, it's not only taken a toll on fisheries, where the fisheries are collapsing, but it's put an evolutionary pressure on fish. If you're a fish that can avoid that fate, you're going to live and pass on your genes to your offspring. There's been a long-running practice of just catching big fish because you want to keep the little fish around so the fisheries don't collapse. Makes sense. But what if a fish kind of hacks your system? What if a fish just grows up and is really small and never gets caught? Well, that's pretty good for that fish. Now, that makes sense in theory, but you might not think that could actually happen in reality. But it has. Fish are getting smaller. When fish reach their sexual maturity, they're doing it much faster, and they're doing it at a smaller size. So we are breeding smaller fish, and this is happening all over the place. It's happening in oceans. It's happening in lakes. This is a worldwide phenomenon. Now, on land, there are people who will kill animals for their big horns. There's a similar logic you can use here. So, if this guy goes out and he spends a whole lot of money, he says, I'm going to kill an animal and I'm going to pose with it. He doesn't want some animal with teeny tusks. He wants an animal with big tusks. Big horns, sorry. And horns are, sorry, I was writing about narwhals and I've got tusks on my mind. So, an animal with big horns, with genes for big horns, it's kind of like the peppered moth, with this guy around with his gun, this is not a great thing to be having. And lo and behold, when you look at studies on rams, for example, you actually see there's been this steady decline over decades in the length of horns on these trophy animals. So not only are we making the fish smaller, we're making these trophy animals' horns smaller as well. We're doing this. We don't realize we're doing it. It's not like we're breeding it. Actually, just the opposite. I'm sure that guy would love for this line to be going the other way. But we're having this evolutionary effect on these animals. Here's some kudzu, and I'm sure at an audience in an arboretum, this is a painful sight. But, you know, invasive plants are another important example of how we are driving evolution. It's not simply just moving a plant from one place to another. I mean, that's just moving it. I mean, that's not evolution per se. I mean, evolution is a change in the genes that a species has. But, you know, when species are moved from one place to another, you know, they might not be able to hack it. They might do just fine with the genes they have, or something else might happen. And that something else happens pretty frequently. What happens is that you get a species like tufted knotweed. Tufted knotweed is a real nuisance these days, but it actually came to the U.S. about a century ago, and it really wasn't much of a problem until the past couple decades. Originally, in East Asia, where it was from, it would just grow in dark, moist places. And here in the U.S., it was not very common, and it would grow on like little forest paths and so on, just in, you know, moist, dark places. And then all of a sudden, people started seeing it out in brightly lit places. It was starting to be found in a lot of places and considered invasive. So what happened? Well, some scientists decided to do another kind of resurrection experiment. And what they did was, they had some seeds that had been saved from 1994, back when they weren't such a nuisance. And they had some seeds that they had just gotten from new plants, which at the time was in 2005. And so they decided we're going to raise them in the same conditions and see what happens. You know, is it just that this, you know, invasive species has just sort of gotten more territory to grow on, or has something happened to the species itself? And actually what's happened is that you can see, this is the number of fruits they produce. And you can see, you know, if they're both growing in low light, everything's fine. Everything's about the same. They don't produce a whole lot, practically nothing really. But if you put them in bright light, the newer ones, these are the newer ones, just produce a whole lot more than the older ones. This little gap there, that's evolution. And it seems that in a lot of cases, invasive species, they go from one place to another, and then a lot of them evolve. We're putting them in a place where they can then evolve, and then in some cases become real pests actually to us. So, so I've given you just a series of examples, and you can kind of look at each one in isolation and say, well, that's interesting, but you know, how important is that overall? You know, how important are we, you know, as drivers of evolution? And I just wanted to bring my talk to an end by just showing you a couple examples of why I think we're probably really important in terms of an evolutionary force. There was a paper that Andrew Hendry and McGill and some other scientists did where they basically tried to look at a lot of the examples that I showed you and to measure the strength of the evolutionary change that happened. They actually, one of the ways of measuring it, you call it a Darwin unit. It's basically like how much something has evolved in a certain amount of time. And they looked at all these natural examples where it was sort of, you know, happening out in the wild someplace, like Darwin's finches. And this is basically what they found. This is how strongly evolution happens in our own time when it's happening in the wild. And then they said, okay, let's look at a bunch of these examples where these things are happening, you know, due to human intervention. If they're happening in places environments that humans have disrupted, if it's clearly humans have sort of set the stage. And that's what they found. In other words, evolution, when it's happening in these human-dominated places, it's stronger. And, you know, it's not, you know, there is definitely some overlap, but it's not like we're making little tweaks on the edges of life. We are driving evolution in a really profound way that you can't ignore. Another way to sort of, you know, take stock of the scope of this sort of civilization-driven evolution is to look at the whole planet. Because we really are a planetary force now. I like this map made by some people at the University of Maryland. Basically, they just created this huge database with all the information they could get about how all the land on Earth was used in 1700 and then in later centuries. You can find this at Ecotope. And basically, when they added it all up, it was a pretty modest amount is being used. A lot semi-natural, which they define as, woodlands, places where people might be harvesting things, but they're not cutting down the forests to turn them into farmland. And you can see that the United States is still pretty wild at that point. Okay, so that's 1700, and then here's 2000. And so you can see how how things have changed dramatically in all the cities in the U.S., lots of villages in India and in China, and also just to sum it up, you can see that here, what used to be kind of over here is now over here. In other words, we're using most of the planet's land now. Not including Antarctica. But in any case, if evolution is happening in these really dramatic ways, when it's induced by humans in one way or another, there's just a lot more real estate where that is happening now. And so, I think that's a clue that, civilization is really incredibly powerful in terms of how things are evolving now. We're changing the planet in some new ways, kind of beyond, hunting for some water buffalo here, or fishing here, or crop dusting over here. We're creating planet-wide changes, and the most important being actually bringing us back to these cold planets. So, initially, scientists realized that burning coal was driving evolutionary change because it was killing off lichen and it was changing the color of trees. And it's certainly true that burning coal produces a lot of soot, a lot of nasty air pollution. It also produces carbon dioxide. And Darwin, ironically, was writing about evolution, thinking about evolution at a time when we were starting to really ramp up the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in what is now, really sort of the dominant scientific story of our age. This is a graph that basically shows you concentrations of carbon dioxide. And the blue portion comes mostly from ice cores. Basically, they go into the ice and they measure how much carbon dioxide are in bubbles that are trapped in there. And they can basically infer what the concentration of the CO2 in the air was. And it kind of bopped between, around 275 and 175 parts per million. And until, and this sort of goes in lockstep with the ice ages. So when you get a lot of carbon dioxide coming out, you are going into warmer periods. And so we came out of the last ice age, and then civilization starts here. And then we go up like that. Actually, this is out of date, now that I realize it. We have actually crossed to 400 now. We're up to 400, so we need to draw that up there. So this is what we are doing to the atmosphere. We're changing the chemistry of the entire atmosphere, and the response that scientists have found is that the climate has been warming and is projected to get a lot warmer. So, so again, this blue line is what we infer about how warm the planet used to be through a lot of these proxies. There are a lot of ways of inferring how warm the planet was in the past by looking at things like tree rings, for example, isotopes and, from sediment and so on. There are a lot of different ways of measuring it. And they generally gives you this picture. Basically, not a whole lot of change. Some change, but not a lot. And we're kind of about here now. And the projections, they're not totally certain. And there's some debate over, how hot the planet gets if you add a certain amount of carbon dioxide to it. But, basically, like, we're here, we're here, we're here. In other words, we're going to be way beyond anything that we've had within human civilization. That's what we're looking at. That's going to mean a lot for us. But, it's also going to mean a lot for the natural world. And one really interesting question is, what's going to happen to evolution? I mean, the planet's gotten warm in the past, and there's still life here. So what will that mean? One possibility is that as the conditions change, life adapts. So think about Darwin's finches. There's a drought, they evolve thicker beaks. A lot of them die in the process, but some of them survive, and there are still Darwin's finches on the Galapagos. So could we be thinking about plants and animals going from being adapted to this temperature to a much warmer one? That's a possibility. And scientists are really only just starting to look at that. I mean, we've already had some warming. We already know that the planet has warmed, and so you can look and see if that's had an effect. Now, I'm not talking about the fact that spring is starting earlier. Like, if you look out, you're going to start seeing trees blooming earlier. They're not evolving. Those trees that are out there now, they've been around for a while. They have the same DNA they had last year. That's not evolution. What we're talking about is, have the genes been changing because some have been more successful reproducing than others? That's a trickier thing to find out. And if you look at the most recent surveys, scientists will say, like, we haven't done enough to find out. But they haven't seen a lot of it. They have seen some cases. So this is thyme. And in France, they are finding that thyme is becoming less freeze resistant. And it's not just some sort of change that's happening to thyme plants, through their own life. It's a genetic change. That the thyme plants that have genes that don't make them bother to defend themselves against frost are doing better, because there are fewer frosts. And so, why waste a lot of investment trying to defend yourself against something that's not happening very much? Put those resources into growing, into making more seeds, into beating those old-fashioned frost-resistant thyme plants. That seems to be what's happening, and it's actually being measured. And this is actually a paper that just came out recently. But again, we don't, the big picture is not actually clear at all. And it could very well be that for a lot of species, evolution may happen, but it may not happen fast enough, so that there will be fewer of them reproducing, they will be dying sooner, they will be having more stress, and natural selection just won't let them adapt. This is, sadly, a graph showing potential extinctions of birds in the Western Hemisphere. So these are different scenarios for climate change. And this is, if the surface warms about 1 degree, we can expect a few percent of birds to become extinct and a bunch of them to be at risk. And then they could be at risk for all the other things we're doing to the planet, like cutting down their habitat. If the warmer things get, the more species are expected to become extinct. People are hoping that we'll sort of warm the planet about 2 degrees Celsius before we finally get our act together and do something about it. But some scientists are fearing that we'll probably get more like 4 degrees or something. So this part, it may not be likely, but we can't rule it out. And then we're starting to talk about major extinctions happening. And that is, unfortunately, a real, that's a feature of evolution too, that life has been marked, the history of life has been marked by mass extinctions. And it's possible that we are entering one now. driven perhaps in large part by climate change. You know, I don't want to leave you on a totally downer note, but so I do want to remind you that about what happened to the peppered moth. Okay, the peppered moth became peppered again. We changed the environment. Life responded. Peppered moths became dark. That was a reflection of us polluting our environment, and we could see it happening in front of us. And then people, for various reasons, decided, you know, we're not going to do this anymore. And so the air here in Boston, in England, is a lot cleaner than it was a few decades ago. And the peppered moths are there to tell us that we made a difference. We actually, if we can drive evolution, we can, to some extent, drive evolution in reverse. And so that should be encouraging, and perhaps encourage all of us to try to do that before it's too late. So thank you very much, and do you have time for questions? Okay, thank you. So the question was, are we being affected sort of in an evolutionary sense by other species? And absolutely. And you know, in the interest of kind of not keeping you here for like 6 hours, I decided one of the things I wasn't going to talk about was what's happening to humans. And there's a classic example, but it's a great one, and it keeps getting better, which is the fact that a lot of you can probably like have some ice cream, drink a milkshake, have a glass of milk, and you're okay. It's all right. You don't feel totally horrible, in other words. You can tolerate the lactose. Most mammals, as adults, are lactose intolerant. And a lot of people on Earth are lactose intolerant. And there's kind of a good sort of basic natural reason for that, which is that you know, milk, you know, is good for young mammals because they nurse and they have that milk, and then they go on and eat other stuff, and they don't need to be making those enzymes for breaking down lactose. It just so happens that you know, several thousand years ago, certain populations, some in East Africa, some in Northern Europe and elsewhere, started domesticating cattle and started drinking a lot of milk, or maybe eating yogurt or so on. And if you had a mutation that made you just keep making that enzyme longer through life, then you could eat that stuff and retain the nutrients. It wouldn't just go right through you. And you'd be more likely to survive a famine, for example. And those mutations spread really fast. There were a number of them. They mostly hit the same 1 or 2 genes, and they just spread like wildfire. And that was, you know, these cows affecting our evolution, but kind of in a cycle. Like, we domesticated the cows affected our genome. So, you know, scientists are continuing to study that example and others. There are lots of them, but that's one that comes to mind the most. Right. So phosphorus is I mean, if you dump a lot of phosphorus or nitrogen into the water, basically you're saying to things that are living in there, grow, and basically you will end up with these huge explosions of all sorts of nasty stuff that, you know, you'll have like lots of algae, and then you have stuff feeding on the algae, all these microbes, and it's just this great ferment. And the upshot of that is actually that there are organisms that are consuming oxygen as they're feeding and growing, and they suck up a lot of the oxygen, and so the oxygen level plummets. And so you can end up with these what are called dead zones. So like at the mouth of the Mississippi, it's a pretty lousy place now, especially for fish, which need a lot of oxygen in their water. So there's been a lot of regulation to get the phosphorus down, and actually, you know, with these water fleas, actually there's a separate set of experiments where scientists are looking at much more recent eggs just in the past 10 or 20, 30 years, and they can see that actually phosphorus, it's sort of like with the peppered moth. You can see the effect of regulations to control phosphorus, that the water fleas are getting, more careful with their phosphorus because the ones that are sloppy with it, they die because there's less phosphorus around. So the question is, why do we call certain species invasive when they're just part of an ecosystem? You correct me if I get this wrong. I mean, the word ends up having some unfortunate overtones. Like I don't know, you think of Visigoths or illegal immigrants or something. Just like oh, it's invasive. It's bad. It's alien. Somebody use that term. I mean, basically, what scientists are groping for when they use these words, and scientists often pick out words without thinking about, the resonance that it'll have. So, scientists have to get better with their use of language and metaphor, but that's another discussion. Anyway, the idea is basically that it's a species that humans have brought from one place to another, and then once it's there, it starts to grow, it starts to spread rapidly and is competing with the species that were already there. That's all it's supposed to connote. And the fact is that invasive species, whatever you want to call these things, they are serious. They're a serious problem, and not just for farmers who are finding that their animals have less to eat because the plants are getting out-competed by these new species. But also they can drive just wild species extinct, so it's a big problem. If you look at like an island like Hawaii, I mean, it came out of the ocean. It was bare. Every quote unquote native species that's there, it got there somehow. Like a bird just dropped some seeds there. They washed, somehow got there by water. So they're all, invaders or aliens, I suppose. But the key is the rate, I think. The rate, you can actually measure, they've done estimates of like how many species like arrive on an island over time, and it's an incredibly rare thing. I mean, it's not easy for a bird to just show up and drop seeds on an island that's in the middle of nowhere. That doesn't happen much. Darwin's finches blew off of South America and settled there, but that was a rare thing. It didn't happen a lot. The rate is just gone through the roof now because of container ships. Every time a container ship shows up and just dumps ballast, like there could be just who knows how many species just pouring out of that water.